Today's occurrence happens in the Republic of Cameroon, when a limnic eruption at a lake caused the surrounding villages to look like the aftermath of a neutron bomb. One man described it saying he couldn't speak and smelled something terrible before he fell unconscious. When he came to, his body was covered in starch and wounds, and he didn't know how he got them. His daughter was dead, and when he went to his neighbor's house, they were dead too. What he didn't realize at the time was that he was one of the lucky survivors, because that terrible smell killed thousands of people and animals within 16 miles or 25 kilometers of Lake Nyos. I'm Tatiana Bunch, and this is the story of the Lake Nyos disaster. Lake Nyos is located on the northwest province of Cameroon, West Africa, in a remote mountainous area known as the Oku volcanic field. The region is described as being fertile and beautiful. The lake itself is a crater lake formed by volcanic activity thousands of years ago, and it's surrounded by lush green hills. At least 6 villages surround the lake, filled with farmers and livestock keepers who relied on the land and the lake for their livelihood. The lake sits away from the main road, and there isn't really a clear path leading to the lake. But the people living in the villages, like Nyos, Sabum, and others, had no reason to think that their lake, that had been there for as long as anyone could remember, would turn deadly. Life was simple. People worked the fields, tended to their animals, and built close-knit communities. There were no signs of danger, no warnings, no reason to believe that literally anything was wrong. In fact, the villagers relied on Lake Nyos. It was a source of water, a place for the animals to graze nearby, and just a part of their daily lives. And during the month of August, people in the area are harvesting groundnuts and rounding up harvesting corn. And because of this, they're enjoying corn fufu and drinking a local drink made of corn. Now, all of the villages in the area had market days where people would come from surrounding towns and villages to the market. Usually, hundreds of people would come to Nyos Market and enjoy themselves buying or selling goods before sleeping there overnight and going home the next day. And this particular Thursday, August 21st, 1986, wasn't too different from the rest. Sabum, one of the villages surrounding the lake, held a market every Saturday. So on Thursday, women would start brewing the local corn beverage to sell at the market. Catholic Christian football teams would be nearby training before returning home. And in general, people were in the region because of the Womb Area Development Authority. They brought people together from all over Cameroon because of their initiatives to open farms in the area, open farm-to-market roads, and introduce mechanized farming. In general, the region was in the process of developing significantly. Anthony Banksy spent the evening doing pastoral visitations with Joseph K. They went to see families and gave them roasted corn and ground nuts for dinner. They were going around to remind everyone about the church work that was happening the next day. Specifically, they wanted to clean and tidy the mission compound to get ready for Father James' visit scheduled for Monday. After finishing with that, Anthony returned to the mission compound at around 9:30 p.m. to meet another pastoral companion named Lawrence. They shared the same bed to sleep that night, and by the next night, only one of them would still be alive. Between 9 and 10 p.m., most of the people in the village were sleeping, but Ephraim Chi wasn't. He was in his mud brick house on a cliff above Lake Nyos and looking at the moonlit water and the hills beyond it. Ephraim was a farmer with 4 kids, and that night, while he looked at the lake, he heard a rumbling that sounded like a rock slide. Immediately after that, he saw a strange white mist rising from the lake. To him, it looked like rain was on the way, and he told his children as much before they all went to bed, feeling just a little sick. At the same time, living below them by the shore of the lake, Halima Sully, a cow herder, was getting ready for bed with her 4 children. She heard a rumbling sound, but to her it sounded like multiple people shouting. A strong wind swept through Halima's extended family's compound house, and she immediately passed out. Quote, like a dead person. Someone else described the lake's sound that night as an explosion followed by a very loud noise that lasted for 30 minutes. The sound was described as the same sound that came from 4 Danish guns going off simultaneously, or like heavy thunder. The sound seemed like it came from the direction of the lake, and about 30 minutes after hearing that sound, anyone who was awake suddenly felt like they were suffocating from a strange gas. The gas smelled like rotten eggs and gunpowder and caused anyone who smelled it to fall weak. Anthony remembered falling asleep in bed on Thursday, August 21st, 1986, and then suddenly finding himself in the grass behind his house on Friday, August 22nd. He remembered waking up around 9 a.m. and being shocked that he was lying on the grass and some pebbles instead of in bed. He looked over and saw Lawrence in the grass nearby, and he sat up to ask him what happened and who the heck brought them out of the house. But right when Anthony opened his mouth to ask the question, he realized he wasn't able to speak, and Lawrence was staring back at him, unable to make a sound. Anthony began uncontrollably coughing, and each time he coughed, he felt a sharp pain around his chest. So he walked back into the house, stumbling and staggering the whole way back to bed. Now, he didn't know what happened, but he assumed their weakness and pain was from lightning or the evil spirit world. He laid there thinking for about an hour, with different ideas crossing his mind, before he decided to go check on Lawrence. When Anthony went back outside, he touched Lawrence and was distraught to feel how cold he was because he had died. All Anthony could feel was the pain and weakness invading his body and felt death was imminent, so he went back to bed. But this time, it wasn't to go to sleep or to rest. It was to, quote, pray for this repose of my soul and wait for a holy death, end quote. While he was praying, another villager named Dennis came up to him, who had just gone through the same thing, and offered Anthony palm oil. Dennis chose to come see Anthony to check on how he was doing after he relieved himself of his pain using the palm oil. Then Dennis left to go check on others, and Anthony decided to go visit some of his family nearby. At the same time, Ephraim woke up to start his day and noticed that the lake, which was normally crystal blue, was now a dull red. He went to the lake's only outlet, where a waterfall is usually coming down from a low spot on the shore. But today, it was dry. It was almost never dry. So after him kind of looking around and noticing complete silence, he realized there weren't any birds singing, no insects chirping, and because this is so unusual, he immediately felt dread. So he started running further down the lake, and he was so scared his knees were shaking. While he was running, he heard shrieking. It was Halima, who had woken up and was so distressed and horrified, she tore off some of her clothing. She spotted Ephraim and yelled for him to come here and kept asking him why her family was lying there and not moving. Getting closer, Ephraim realized that Halima was surrounded by the remains of her children, 31 of her other family members, and the 400 cattle they owned. The only person unaccounted for was Halima's husband, who spent the night in a completely different village and was spared from all of this. Ephraim tried to look away, but once he saw Halima trying to shake her father awake, he realized there weren't even flies on the remains, because the flies were dead too. So he sprinted downhill to the village of Lower Nyos, where the rest of his family was. He needed to see if they were okay, but when he got there, he saw practically every one of the 1,000 residents in the village dead. Ephraim's parents, aunts, uncles, and siblings were all lying around dead too. He started crying and couldn't stop because he believed that this day in August in 1986 was the last day on Earth. He thought it was the end of the world. And I can't blame him, because it turns out that in Lower Nyos, only a mother and a child survived. Everyone else in that village died. Now, about this time, Anthony Bangsy had made it to the compound where his paternal uncle, maternal aunt, and cousin were living. Right outside of the compound house that they shared, Anthony found his uncle lying on the ground, already dead, with his aunt beside him crying. Anthony's aunt tried to describe what happened and told him that something carried them from the house and flung them outside, where they all fell in the same spot. She said that the uncle struggled in the hands of an invisible force until he died, and that Anthony's cousin was nowhere to be found. Hearing that, Anthony got his aunt and another survivor to help him find his cousin. After some searching, they found their remains behind the compound across from theirs. Looking around and seeing rain on the way, and realizing that more than just his family was outside, he and the other survivor started putting the remains back into their appropriate houses. While visiting the other houses, Anthony was horrified to see that there were barely any homes without at least 5 bodies inside. Many of the victims were found where they usually were around 9 o'clock at night, whether that was lying near the cooking fire, in bed, or clustered in doorways. It all suggested that most people died on the spot. But in other instances, it was clear that some people had been unconscious for over a day when they woke up to see their entire family gone, which caused them to take their own lives. When Anthony got to the house closest to the Catholic Church house, he looked inside to see the entire family gone. In another home, he found a baby that survived, but the mother died. Anthony also found someone who had breathed in the gas, lost control, and fell into a bush, but somehow survived. That night, Anthony was torn, trying to figure out where he would spend the night. When the lake exploded, an order banning any entry into the area was given. The only 2 nurses who would have been able to help anyone in the area were dead, and all of the homes were filled with remains, including his. He didn't want to spend the night with Lawrence's remains, but he felt it would be disrespectful to try and go somewhere else to stay. While he was trying to figure out what to do, he found a child from a house where all 7 children in the household survived, but their mother didn't, so he stayed with them instead. On Saturday morning, Anthony found a pregnant woman who was in bad condition and couldn't walk by herself, so he helped her. He brought her to the health center, but of course there was no one there to help her, and any vehicles that were coming to help survivors were unable to make it that far to them because they were being filled with people trying to get away to save their lives. In the end, the pregnant woman didn't make it, and she became part of the 1,746 people and 3,500 livestock that were killed. Joseph N., a survivor from Subum, described his experience, and this is a rough translation as, quote, "I cannot speak, I became unconscious. I could not open my mouth because then I smelled something terrible. I heard my daughter snoring in a terrible way, very abnormal. When crossing to my daughter's bed, I collapsed and fell. I was there until 9 a.m, until a friend of mine came and knocked at my door. I was surprised to see that my trousers were red, had some stains like honey. I saw some starchy mess on my body. My arms had some wounds. I didn't really know how I got these wounds. I opened the door. I wanted to speak. My breath would not come out. My daughter was already dead. I went to my daughter's bed thinking she was still sleeping. I slept till it was 4:30 in the afternoon. Then I managed to go over to my neighbor's house. They were all dead. I decided to leave because most of my family was in womb. I got on my motorcycle. A friend whose father had died left with me. As I rode through Nyos, I didn't see a sign of a single living thing. When I got to womb, I was unable to walk, even to talk. My body was completely weak." End quote. All kinds of theories swirled about what caused the eruption. By Saturday evening, scientists from around the world swarmed to Nyos, and at first they assumed that the dormant volcano under the lake's crater erupted and sent out some sort of deadly fume. The locals believed it to be more spiritual. Cameroon is about the size of the state of California, and the nation has over 200 ethnic groups. So every few miles, you'll run into a different language. There's a mixture of Islam, Christianity, and animist cults, all living amongst each other. But Nyos Lake's name in one regional language means good, and in a related language, it means to crush. Well, local mythology for the area hints at people around Nyos being somewhat aware that the lake could be dangerous. Cameroonians have a special category for lakes, which are said to be the homes of spirits or ancestors, but sometimes they're a source of death. Certain ethnic groups want houses built on high ground, possibly because collective memories see it as a defense against disaster. Ephraim Cheese people, the Bafmen, have lived there for hundreds of years and kept with that tradition. Remember, he was the one on the cliff, so he was settled in Upper Nyos, but almost 100 years ago, other groups started moving to the area, and they didn't follow that custom. Like Halima and her family, who are Muslims, they settled on Lower Nyos' slopes, but by the time of the expulsion, several hundred people were in that area, including some of Ephraim Cheese family, who were Christians. But Ephraim remembers a story he learned from his grandfather where a group of villagers decided to cross Lake Nyos. And similar to how God parted the Red Sea for Israelites, a man parted the waters of Lake Nyos. But in a shocking twist, a mosquito bit the man where the sun don't shine, and when he swatted the insect, he lost his hold on the water and every villager drowned. And while the details have probably been changed over time, the underlying idea to that story shows that something similar may have happened in the past. And in fact, 2 years before this happened at Lake Nyos, A similar incident happened about 60 miles south of there. A bone-shaped crater lake named Manaun was surrounded by farms and part of it was bordered by a road. Well, on August 15th, 1984, Abdouin was biking to a village when he went down a dip in the road. Parked by the road was a pickup truck owned by a local Catholic priest, Louis K. When Abdou went up to the vehicle, he found Louis's remains next to the truck and 9 more in and around the truck. But on top of the truck, there were 2 people still alive. They weren't sure what happened to everyone else below them, though. The only thing the 2 people sitting on top of the truck could tell Abdou was that the vehicle stalled once they started driving through that area. So the driver got out of the car to see what was going on under the hood, and he eventually collapsed. After some time, the people in the pickup truck, but under the cover and the bed of it, decided to get out to see what was going on. And everyone who got out of the vehicle to go check on what was happening in the front collapsed. Seeing everyone fall out kept them from deciding to go down to see what was going on. So Abdou continued on, and he found another man's remains on a stalled motorcycle. Abdou didn't know what to think because he could tell something terrible happened. At first he thought it was a car accident, and then he got stuck in a trance that made him too weak to ride his own bike, so he had to continue walking on foot. While he was walking, he went by a herd of dead sheep and more stalled vehicles filled with remains of people inside. Now, at the other side of the dip, he had to go uphill again, and that's where he ran into his friend, Adamu, walking towards him. He tried to warn Adamu to turn back, but Abdou lost his ability to speak, so he grabbed Adamu's hand and shook it silently, but his friend just kept going in the direction of the fog. Abdou made it to the village alive, but Adamu and the 36 other people traveling that low area of road didn't survive. After that disaster, rumors came out instantly. Some believed bad actors were trying to mount a coup, or, in the opposite direction, that the government performed a chemical attack. There were all sorts of conspiracy theories going on around Cameroon, but after officials looked into the geology, they believed the dormant volcano under Lake Manaun reactivated. Now, with rumors of chemical attacks or biological weapons, the U.S. obviously wanted to know what was going on and had to get involved. So the U.S. Embassy in the area brought in a volcanologist, who I'll call H, to investigate after a few months, and he did several tests. H found no indication of temperature increase in the water, no sulfur compounds, the lake bed wasn't even disturbed. But when he got a water sample bottle from deep within the lake, the lid popped off because the water was loaded with carbon dioxide. So H concluded that the deaths around Lake Manaun were from carbon dioxide asphyxiation. While carbon dioxide is what you normally exhale when breathing, and it happens burning fossil fuels and believed to be the main culprit in global warming, it's a colorless, odorless gas, heavier than air, that in high concentrations completely displaces oxygen. Air with 5% carbon dioxide snuffs out car engines and candles. At 10%, people will get dizzy and hyperventilate before falling into a coma. By 30%, you'll start gasping before you drop dead. After a few more weeks of investigation, H believed that carbon dioxide from magma degassing deep under Lake Manaun had moved up into the lake's bottom layers of water for possibly centuries, and that created a huge secret time bomb. The gas would build up and dissolve in the water and then suddenly explode, immediately releasing a wave of concentrated carbon dioxide. The government covered it up, which wasn't hard to do considering the lack of phone service or electricity in the area. H wrote up his findings and named the phenomenon a hitherto unknown natural hazard before he submitted his study to Science, a prestigious U.S. journal. He submitted his findings a few months before the Nyos disaster, and Science rejected H's study because it seemed far-fetched and only a few specialists had even heard of it. Because Nyos blowing up killed so many more people than Manaun, it couldn't be covered up, and the news of the disaster spread internationally very quickly. So by the time scientists from different countries made it to Nyos on Saturday, the Cameroon military had started burying victims in mass graves, and that is finally when survivors were taken to hospitals. While the scientists were investigating the lake, some of the remains were given autopsies before they were buried, and some of them were buried in mission cemeteries, but most were buried in their homes in mass graves because there wasn't enough help. As soon as any survivors buried their family, they left because they believed the lake still had gas that could release at any moment. For Anthony, he remembers this being the Saturday that Father James, his mentor, and the man who was preparing to visit the area on Monday, showed up. Father James was distraught and believed that all of the pastoral men were dead, until he heard Anthony in the cemetery preparing graves for the Christians that died. Apparently, he urged Anthony to continue giving Christians a Christian burial and spent some more time with him before he had to leave. Anthony did as he was told to give the Christians a Christian burial, even though some of the other locals who weren't of that faith didn't understand what he was doing. They felt like he was wasting their time. After handling a few more things, Anthony walked 2 hours to his home village to find his mother and siblings. His mother believed he had died and had started announcing his funeral, but when he returned, they were beyond happy. Anthony then went to the hospital, and his family threw Anthony a huge party when he went back home. And then someone else threw him another big party. Meanwhile, the scientists and researchers were taken in by the survivors, which shocked them because they were surrounded by mass graves, thousands of cattle dead and decomposing all over the place, and it had started raining heavily. The survivors had lost everything, and with all of that going on, they were taking care of them. Over the next few weeks, they studied the lake and discovered what happened. So Nyos is 682 feet or 208 meters deep. It sits on a porous carrot-shaped deposit of volcanic rubble left from old eruptions. It's unknown if the carbon dioxide is there from old activity or if it's forming now in the magma below. But wherever it comes from, the gas is transported through underwater springs and into the bottom of the lake. Now, normally in most lakes, gases like CO2 or carbon dioxide would naturally rise to the surface and dissipate into the atmosphere in small amounts. But Lake Nyos is different because it's so deep and its structure created the perfect conditions for trapping the CO2 instead of allowing it to escape. The water at the bottom of the lake was colder, denser, and more saturated with CO2 than the water at the surface. As the gas seeped into the bottom layers of the lake, it dissolved and built up over time, creating a sort of pressurized gas chamber at the bottom. Think of it like shaking a bottle of pop. If the cap is tight, the carbon dioxide stays dissolved in the liquid under pressure. But if you open the bottle, all the gas is released in a rush, making the fizzy explosion. Lake Nyos was like a huge, tightly sealed pop bottle with CO2 dissolved at the bottom and waiting for the cap to be opened. Where Nyos is located, the cold weather causes the surface water to become dense and sink, forcing the lower layers to go up, and in the spring, it's reversed. If the lake were more north or south, then seasonal temperatures changes would cause the water to mix and stop any carbon dioxide buildup. But because Lake Nyos and Manaus are equatorial, the top layers rarely mix with the deeper layers. But then something had to set it off. So it's speculated that boulders falling into the lake caused the explosion. Ephraim Chi said he heard the sound of rocks falling, and the scientists there at the time noticed an adjacent cliff looked like it had a recent rock slide. Others believed a small volcanic eruption occurred on the bed of the lake, or that cool rainwater falling on one side of the lake caused the overturn. A drop in air pressure could have caused the surface water to cool and sink. An exact reason was never really agreed upon, but I think the rock slide is what's believed to be the most likely cause. But what is known is that the water saturated with carbon dioxide was forced up from the bottom of the lake. As the water ascended, the pressure which allowed the dissolved CO2 to come out of solution quickly created a massive release of carbon dioxide gas, which formed a thick invisible cloud around a 330-foot column of water that turned into an 80-foot wave that swept the shore on one side. The water broke trees and stripped vegetation a couple hundred feet high. Scientists estimate that up to 300,000 tons of CO2 released in just a few minutes. To give you a rough idea of what that's like, it's almost the equivalent to the gas produced by the eruption of Mount St. Helens, just without any fire, lava, or ash. Just to give you a scale of how much that is. And because of that huge burst of water, they discovered the lake was 4 feet lower than what it had been. The water turned red because the deeper water was rich in iron, and once it was brought to the surface, it was oxidized by the air. Now, because carbon dioxide is heavier than air, instead of rising and dispersing, the gas cloud hugged the ground, flowing down from the lake into the surrounding valleys where the nearby villages were located. The cloud moved quickly, spreading across an area of 16 miles or 25 kilometers, suffocating nearly everything in its path. It's why Ephraim Chi and his kids were able to stay safe. But Halima's family wasn't. The villagers and animals had no chance, though there were reports that those closer to the lake heard the explosion and tried to run away, which could be what Halima heard. They were found on paths leading away from town. Since CO2 displaces oxygen, anyone in the path of the gas would have passed out within seconds, and without oxygen, they died shortly after. Many victims appeared to simply fall asleep where they stood, with no signs of struggle, and unless they moved to fresh air within minutes, they suffocate and die. At some point, the military ordered survivors to move out of the region, about 4,000 people altogether. Scientists made frequent return trips to study both of the lakes and to make the region safe for anyone who wanted to come back. Repeated tests showed that the explosion didn't get rid of all of the carbon dioxide, and it was in fact accumulating rapidly. The researchers believed that certain layers of Manaus could become saturated with carbon dioxide within a few years, and Nyos would follow sometime after that, if they were left untouched. But either lake could explode at any moment, even without saturation, so they considered different solutions, from dropping bombs to digging tunnels in the lake bed to drain the gas-filled bottom layer to dumping massive amounts of lime to neutralize the gas. They eventually decided to run a pipe from the deepest water layer to the surface, so the gas would gradually release and disperse harmlessly in the air. Some researchers didn't think vent pipes would work and feared it might set off a new explosion. It could cause the bottom water to spurt through the pipes and onto the surface of the lake. That water being denser would then sink and cause turbulence leading to another explosion. One of the engineers designing and installing the equipment admitted to being worried because they were in an area of science without a whole lot of known information, and it was really dangerous. But in 1990, a team tested garden hose diameter pipes in both of the lakes and moved to progressively larger pipes in 2 and 3 year increments. It ended up working because the gas was venting, but then the money ran out. Cameroon's government couldn't afford the $2 to $3 million bill to have permanent degassing installations put in. International aid agencies didn't grasp the concept because they're used to helping after natural disasters instead of preventing them. So the researchers who worked on discovering the problem lobbied oil companies, governments, and other organizations to pay for the venting. And finally, the U.S. Office of Foreign Disaster Assistance came up with over $400,000 for a permanent pipe to be installed at Nyos in 1999. By January 2001, researchers were working to assemble rafts and piping at the lake, with everyone having emergency oxygen tanks on standby, courtesy of the Cameroon military. They attached a raft to the middle of Lake Nyos, where an almost 6-inch in diameter pipe reached 666 feet to the deepest water layer. Once they were done, everyone moved to high ground, and a remote control button was pushed to activate the pump that primes the pipe. Right after that, a 150-foot spray moving 100 miles an hour shot into the sky, and everyone around started cheering because they were able to successfully start the degassing of Lake Nyos. Now that was just the beginning, because 5,500 tons of carbon dioxide pour into the lake yearly. One pipe was barely enough to keep up, and it was believed at the time that it would take over 30 years before enough dissolved carbon dioxide would be released for the lake to be safe. It's possible 5 pipes could do the job in only 5 or 6 years, but no one was willing to fund it. People eventually started moving back into the area, but living on high ground. They have to travel by the lake on low ground, but people felt better prepared this time around. In 2003, a venting pipe was installed at Lake Manaus, but 2 years later, a study found that gas wasn't being removed from the lake quickly enough. In 2011, 2 more pipes were installed at Lake Nyos, and in 2013, lake degassing pipes were upgraded with small solar-powered rotary pumps. 2 more of those solar pumps were needed to avoid long-term buildup in the lake. By 2019, it said the degassing was pretty much in steady state, so only one of the installed pipes would be needed to self-sustain the degassing process moving forward, without any need for external power. Following this disaster, scientists investigated other African lakes to see if a similar phenomenon could happen anywhere else. In 2005, it was believed that Lake Kivu in the Democratic Republic of the Congo could be at risk. The lake is 2,000 times larger than Lake Nyos, but after finding errors in the study, a new study in 2020 found that the risk of a gas eruption there didn't seem to be increasing over time. The Lake Nyos disaster has got to be one of the most unique and deadly natural disasters I've ever heard of and that exist in modern history. To this day, Lake Nyos and Lake Manaun are the only two times something like this has ever happened. Today, the phenomenon is known as a limnic eruption, and scientists continue to study Lake Nyos and other crater lakes, hoping to learn more about these rare but deadly events. But, can you imagine waking up to see your family and friends and animals all around you dead and not know what's going on? And this being the 1980s in Africa, you don't have a phone to pull up the internet, call someone, call 911, and figure out what's going on. I genuinely can't imagine going through that, living through it. I don't even know what I would do. And these people lost everything. Families wiped out. Just to even try to begin to recover, that had to be a big deal. I believe they said over 800 people were hospitalized, and those that were eventually recovered. But to have almost 2,000 people die from something like this, when 2 years earlier it happened on a smaller scale, but it was covered up. So instead of people being aware that this could happen, they were just completely taken by surprise. I have no words. But I digress. Follow or subscribe if you haven't already, and stay safe. I'll be back next Thursday. All sources can be found at occurrencepod.com, which is linked in the show notes, along with any other relevant information.